In 2007, when the crisis hit, the Federal Reserve published a number. And the number measured the proportion of the disposable income. That's the income a person has after they pay their basic fixed costs. The proportion of your disposable income that was used to, quote, service your debt. That is, pay interest on the money you borrowed and repay at least a small portion of it. That number reached a historical high of 14%. 1 out of $7 earned by an American worker wasn't available for him or her to buy anything. It was simply being shunted off to the creditors. Okay? In this situation, the mass of people are poor. They're pinched. Life is harder. Problems are riskier. Jobs are more insecure. Whereas the people who are collecting at the top are floating in money. But to make a long story short, the inequality of income and wealth in the United States changed. And I want to show you this, my last little picture here. This is the percentage of the total income earned in the United States taken home by the top 10% of income earners. Okay? We start in 1917. It's interesting, the United States government starts a graph in 1917. It's the only time I've ever seen them start in 1917, a year they wish had never happened because of things that happened far away. Anyway, in 1917, the top 10% earned 40% of the income. By 1929, they were earning 60% of the income. It then collapsed way down here until around, you guessed it, the 1970s, when it goes right back up. So that the top 10% now get somewhere between 50 and 60% of all the income. Let me make sure you understand that. The richest 10% of Americans take home more than half the income there is. The other 90% share the other half. Okay? This is an extraordinarily sharp inequality. 30 years ago, the distribution of income between rich and poor was less in the United States than in any other advanced industrial country. Now the inequality is greater than in any other. We have become a sharply unequal society. In the history of the human race, that kind of a sharp inequality, especially in a short time, and especially in a society that commits itself to a certain kind of equality of opportunity and so on, is very hard to swallow. It produces serious social tensions. What we're seeing with the Tea Parties is probably only the very beginning. And this hostility to immigrants, these are the signs of people in distress, feeling that their opportunities are slipping away, and looking for scapegoats to blame in this situation. If you look not at income, but at wealth, it's even starker. I have all the sources for all these numbers, for any of you that are interested. According to the United Nations, the wealthiest 10%. Now, wealth means how much you own, not how much you earn. This is a chart about your flow of earnings, your income. But if we look at what you own, top 10% own, in the United States, 69.8% of all assets. Okay? The top 10% own 70% of the assets, and the remaining 90% share the other 30% of the assets. The only country in this list here that is more unequal than us is Switzerland. That's not a notable thing to say about a country. That you're the only country that's more unequal than you is Switzerland. By comparison, just so you understand, the United States, the top 10% own 70% of the assets. In Canada, our neighbor to the north, the top 10% own 53% of the assets. That's a lot less. In Japan, the top 10% own 39%. Much, much, much less unequal society than this one. No comparison. And it's something to keep in mind, and that has become much sharper in the last little period of time. Last point. Is all of this inevitable? Is all of this unchangeable? Is all of this fixed? The answer clearly is no. And I want to give you an example, one in the United States and one in Europe, of people moving against this. First, the one here in the United States. And I'm going to tell you very briefly the story of the state of Oregon. Anyone here from Oregon? Too bad. You'd be pleased by what I'm about to tell you. In the summer of 2009, the state of Oregon faced the same crisis that affects every other state. Because of unemployment, because of housing foreclosures, the revenues received by cities from their tax base or for states from their tax base collapse. So every state government, every governor, every state legislature, every mayor, every city government was faced with, oh my God, what are we going to do? The money coming in, the tax payments have dropped off. Most of them said, okay, here's what we got to do. We either have to raise taxes, raise the rates, to recoup the money not being paid us by unemployed people and people who are homeless and so on, or we have to cut back spending, lay off public workers, reduce public services. California led the way under the leadership of that profound bodybuilding governor. They led the way in slashing government spending, laying off teachers and security guards and state troopers and firefighters and all of this. Huge numbers of layoffs and everything else. Cut back services. Here in New York, our Governor Patterson had the brilliant insight of taking away from school children their right to go to and from the school on a bus without paying for the bus. You need an exceptional new program like that, okay? The state of Oregon made a decision, very interesting. The state of Oregon has a Democratic governor, and the Democrats control both houses of the legislature of the state of Oregon. They went on record. They are a little left, I mean a little left of the Democratic Center. They said, we don't believe in that. We're not going to do it. We're not going to cut government employment, and we're not going to cut public services. And here's how we're going to deal with the collapse of revenue, $700 million short for 2 years in Oregon. We're going to raise taxes on businesses and rich people. I didn't make this up. And the legislature debated the bill, and they passed the bill. Here's what the bill says. All businesses are going to pay much higher tax than they did before. Families that earn over $250,000 a year are going to see a big rise, and families that earn over $500,000 a year are going to see a bigger rise in their taxes. That's what we're going to do. The legislator passed this law, sent it to the governor, he signed the bill. It became law, and the Republicans and the business community had a conniption in Oregon. And because it's Oregon, they have the right of referendum and recall in a way that we in the East don't need, because we don't have governments we would need to recall. But they do out there. And so they were able quickly to force a referendum that the people of Oregon would be able to override what the governor and the legislature did if they wanted to in a public vote. The vote happened at the end of January of this year. 1.2 million Oregonians, you can see where the story is going, went to the polls and clearly and decisively voted for the bill. And so that's the one state out of 50 in the United States that shows us there's another way. There it is, there's another way. You don't have to cut the services, you don't have to lay off the workers. You can go and tax the people who've done out like bandits for the last 30 years, so that if anybody ought to be taxed, it's them. I did a little calculation, so inspired was I by the Oregonian. Some of you know about this calculation because I published it recently. I went to the Merrill Lynch Corporation, which keeps a record of what are called, you'll love this if you're not familiar with this, high net worth individuals. They're called HNWIs. If that's new to you, it's because you're not one of them. A high net worth individual is a person, an individual in the United States or the whole world, who has, in addition to whatever house he or she owns, or car, or personal possessions, at least $1 million of investable assets, stocks, bonds, cash. 1 million or more. If you are in that category, you're a high net worth individual. And Merrill Lynch is, of course, extremely interested in them because that's the person you want as a client if you're Merrill Lynch. So they keep track of them. It's the best resource there is. So I went and looked at it. There's about 3 million of those folks in the United States. So roughly a little under 1% of our population, maybe 0.8, 0.9% are in that group. And Merrill Lynch calculates their total asset. What do they own, these people? It's a very impressive sum. About 12 trillion with a T. That's what they owe. So I did a little calculation. I said, how much of a deficit did the United States government have in 2009? When the government stimulated our economy with $800 billion spending, when the government really went all out. The government borrowed $1.7 trillion.